All right, LinkedIn Live audience, we are broadcasting this conversation a few different places today. So we've got the LinkedIn Live right here at Adaptive Challenge Consulting. You on LinkedIn. We also are live streaming on Facebook, and then also we have an audience with us on Google Meet right over here. So if you're in the Google Meet again, if you just joined, feel free to migrate over to Adaptive Challenge Consulting on LinkedIn. The Adaptive Challenge Consulting on LinkedIn live stream is where you'll be able to see the slides and also join that chat as well. I am going to try to keep up with the Google Meet chat some, but that's a little trickier given sort of the way that screen is set up. But otherwise, good afternoon and welcome to part 2 of our 7-part series on leading with emotional intelligence. And so if you don't know, I'm Dr. Alan Mueller, and I'm the author of Leading with Emotional Intelligence. It's my first book. Although when I used to work in education in the academy, I did publish some things. This is the first book that's really fully mine. And so thank you for joining us. Those of you who were here last week, you got to know a little bit about the author. So I shared a little bit about my story and my entrance into why I ended up studying leadership, because so much of the study was informal, and then eventually the study became formal, and I ended up getting a bunch of degrees and studying leadership programs. And so I've spent the better part of 30 years informally and formally both studying leadership, teaching leadership, creating leadership programs for college students, leadership programs for working professionals. And then I even created an academic minor for leadership. And for those of you in the Google call, just please mute. But also in the Google call, if you want to join us over on LinkedIn Live, that's where you'll see the slideshow and the live chat and all that jazz. So today's topic is, where did we get the idea of leadership, right? You can do a scholarly study. You can do sort of a study and look at business practices and look at what different corporations and companies and nonprofits say about what leadership is. And we have some different definitions, but it's rare that we pause and kind of go, where did these definitions come from? So first of all, when I say we, I'm talking mostly about the United States, right? My father's an immigrant right off the boat. I know that I have to be real about this, that the leadership norms established in the US were largely established by people that looked like me, right? Overwhelmingly white men. And that's not to say that there wasn't leadership in other communities, but when it comes to the workplace, white men dominated that space in management for decades. Even after our workplaces got more diverse, the management of the workplaces has still lagged behind that diversity. And so a lot of the ideas are sort of based in this westernized, the fact that we're in a colonized country in the United States. That's the frame I'm using here, right? I've studied some international leadership concepts, and that's a topic for another day. But for today, it's going to be, hey, did you grow up in the US or do you work in the US? And we're going to talk about where we here in the US got these ideas of leadership. So again, welcome to the LinkedIn Live audience. Welcome to the Google Meet audience. The Google Meet audience is over here. And if you want to join the chat, go over to LinkedIn Live and we'll be able to see the chat. If you're in the chat, go ahead and let us know where you're from. I love to know where people are joining us from, and also what industry you're part of. I think most of the people who join these conversations are part of HR teams and or colleges and universities and or K-12. Those are sort of the main 3 groups that tend to show up. But we get people from a lot of industries. So definitely chime in what industry you're part of, what, where you're from, those kinds of things. So let's get into it. Yeah, what is leadership? So as you may know, the cradle of civilization, sort of the area around the Mediterranean Sea, where there are a lot of kingdoms that we have good records of, right? And so in these various kingdoms, overwhelmingly, the leader by default was a king or a queen. That's just sort of how it was. And so when you think about that, there was not really an opportunity for people to think about what they wanted in a leader, right? If you grew up in a monarchy, which again, North Africa, Southern Europe, sort of that western edge of Asia that's close to the Mediterranean, all of those, that kind of area where there were all of those monarchies and all of those kingdoms, literally you were born a leader, right? And so whoever your parent was, if they were the king or the queen, they had a kid, and then that kid became the leader, right? I see a comment from Corey. Will I be sending these slides? Corey, send me an email. I'm happy to send them to you 100%. And so when you think about that, the idea that people would be thinking about what leaders are is a little nonsensical in a way, right? Because you were told who the leader was. So when you were a king or a queen, does anybody want to guess in the chat where you said you got the authority to lead? Generally, kings and queens, who or what did they say gave them the authority to be the leader? I'll give you a hint. It's usually the divine, right? It's God or it's the gods or whatever system they were in. They would say, well, that's who chose me to be leader based on this divine succession, and that's why I'm the leader, right? So questioning that was tricky, right? Questioning that was tricky. So I don't know about y'all. I know people, and you can put in the chat if you've had this experience. I know people who, I know them. I know like couples that are really, really cool. And then sometimes I meet their kid and then I see their kid and I'm like, oh my gosh, what happened? Like this kid, the parents were so cool. This kid didn't turn out so well, right? I don't know if you've had that experience, but that one of the hiccups, one of the challenges of those monarchies is sometimes a king or a queen would have a kid, and that king or a queen might have been benevolent and loved by their people and might have been exhibiting leadership. And then they have a kid who's like drunk with the power and doesn't really want to lead and just wants to sit in the title and lets the people suffer, etc. I see a lot of the people in the chat saying, yes, God was the one who would bestow on these folks, right? These folks would say, I've been imbued by the power of the divine to be your king or queen, so you better not question it. Well, in Europe and also in North Africa and Europe, there were all of these wisdom schools. And some of these wisdom schools, the Freemasons are one of the more well-known ones. The Illuminati, not the Illuminati you're probably thinking of, but the Bavarian Illuminati in southern Germany. The Rosicrucian order, which is an active order to this day. It's not as big or well known as the Freemasons, but it counts among its members famous people like Walt Disney and other artists and free thinkers. But the Freemasons in particular and other groups like that in Europe started meeting in secret. And they started asking these questions like, what if the queen is wrong? What if the king is wrong? Like, what if they're wrong, right? And so those kinds of questions could get you killed in most monarchies, right? To actually question the king or the queen, you could be in major trouble, right? And so when they were having these conversations in private, they were having this, what was at the time sort of esoteric thought about, well, what if we overturned the queen, or what if we overturned the king, or what if we fomented a revolution? And then, among other things, the French Revolution happened, right? In part influenced by these thoughts that were done in private, because they were risky to have. Those were risky conversations to have. And so the French Revolution, I don't know if you've ever seen the musical Les Mis. I've seen it several times. I love it. I'm not going to sing Les Mis for you, although I could a little bit. But the French Revolution, there was this idea that egalitarian thought was cropping up of we are a group of people that we should have some self-determination in maybe picking our leaders. Eventually, this led also, the U.S. Revolution was a big part of that as well. And so this egalitarian thought, of course, with the revolution in North America, the U.S. Revolution, there were some great founding documents like the Declaration of Independence that said things like all men are created equal, right? Of course, they used the word men, which that's men and not women. And at the time, of course, most of those men were also enslaving other men and women. And so it was a lofty ideal that was very unrealized, but it was still a lofty ideal, right? And so history is complicated and sticky and not always pretty, but the ideal was relatively new when you think about how far back monarchies were going, right? How long monarchies had existed. And in monarchies, one would not need to ask the question, what is a leader and what do I want in a leader? Because it had already been determined by birth and by claims that it was from the divine, that authority came from the divine. And so understand that notions, when we say leadership, when we think about what a leader is, or who a leader is, or what they do, these concepts back in the day when most countries in sort of the civilized cradle of civilization, most were monarchies, those kinds of questions would, number one, be nonsensical, and number two, could get you killed. So if you have questions or thoughts, put them in the chat, but I'm going to move to the next phase, right? So we're in the US now, and the influence of the Industrial Revolution cannot be understated. There's a great book by Thomas Friedman. Thomas Friedman is a Pulitzer Prize winning author. He's sort of, in my view, sort of a pop economist. He helps people like me who don't have a degree in economics understand economics. So Thomas Friedman, one of his books was called The World is Flat, which I highly recommend. I read it in my doctoral program, and it was transformative for me in understanding global economies for someone who's not an economist. I'm not an economist, but his language really, really helped me understand it. One of the things that he talks a lot about is sort of the Industrial Revolution and how we're changing to the information age. And I think there are more ages coming. But in the Industrial Revolution, if you can rewind your mind for a minute and think about, in the Industrial Revolution, what were the big things happening in the US, right? There were people trying to build cars more efficiently, Henry Ford and the assembly line. Cheeseburgers, right? Before McDonald's came around, overwhelmingly, if you wanted to get a cheeseburger somewhere, it was cooked one at a time. And in the Industrial Revolution, there were all these innovations about efficiency, efficiency, efficiency. How can we make our products more efficiently? That's one of the primary questions that the Industrial Revolution was asking. McDonald's was like, hey, friends, hold my beer, because instead of cooking cheeseburgers one at a time, we're going to build a grill that can hold 32 burgers, and then another grill that's going to come down on top of it, and we're going to cook it from the top and the bottom simultaneously and cook them more efficiently, 32 burgers at once, right? So because the Industrial Revolution was dominated by the questions of how can we make more things more efficiently, what we came to understand as leadership in the Industrial Revolution followed along that, right? Leadership became simply, how much influence do you have over people? Can you get the people on the factory floor to make the shoes faster, to make the cars faster, to make burgers more efficiently? Whatever you're trying to produce during the Industrial Revolution, the ultimate question for leaders was efficiency, efficiency, efficiency. You may notice up in the corner there, if you're on the LinkedIn Live and if you're on the Google Meet, just know that my new book is called Leading with Emotional Intelligence. And so many of the components that leadership experts who talk about emotionally intelligent leadership discuss, so many of those features were not that important in the Industrial Revolution. They weren't. Part of it was because those big questions were all about efficiency, efficiency, efficiency. Another part of it was the workforce was overwhelmingly men and overwhelmingly white, right? Through World War II, we have Rosie the Riveter show up as a symbol of women entering the workforce in big, bold new ways. Society had largely been telling women for decades, hey, you've got some career options. They're called nurse, teacher, or stay-at-home parent. Those are your options. Pick one, right? And then when World War II was happening, suddenly women had all of these other options. I'm a little bit of a Myers-Briggs nerd, and those of you who know me know that I think the Myers-Briggs, when used correctly, can be a really powerful tool. Isabella Briggs Myers, who wrote the Myers-Briggs, was very concerned when women started entering the workforce around World War II. She was very concerned about that because many women hadn't had an honest conversation with themselves, gone about the business of self-discernment of what do I want in a career, because society had been telling women, these are your three options, pick one, right? And so part of the formation of the Myers-Briggs was Isabella Briggs Myers looking at her contemporaries, looking at the other women in her communities and saying, hey, how are we going to discern where we can fit? Not that the Myers-Briggs is really a career fit tool, but it was a really important sort of part of the development, right? And so I'm seeing a little bit of chat in the Google Meet. An AI assistant is taking some notes. Great. And I see Katrina, Jacksonville, Arkansas. Oh, fantastic. Minister Ohio chiming in. So again, during the Industrial Revolution, ultimately, kind of the amount of influence you had over someone was leadership, right? There wasn't much more considered by most people in the industrialized United States about what leadership could be. There's an amazing proverb about Yoshi the Stonecutter, and I want to be careful because it's not from my culture. It's from an East Asian culture, but the premise is that there was a stonecutter. This is a sort of a metaphor. There was a stonecutter who was cutting stone off of a mountain to take back to the village, and the stonecutter was really unhappy with his lot in life. And the stonecutter one day wished to himself, gosh, I wish I was the sun, because he was working in the heat and he realized the sun had power. And so magically in this proverb, he becomes the sun. And when he becomes the sun shining down on the village, helping the plants grow, but also overheating some things here and there. And one day, the stonecutter who has become the sun is shining in a particular place, and his sunshine gets blocked by a cloud. And then he pauses and realizes, wait a second. Well, in some ways, the cloud has more power than the sun. So he wishes to be the cloud, and he becomes the cloud. So when he becomes the cloud, he can pour rain where he needs. He can rain on the crops that need water. He can put shade on workers for on a hot day. But then one day he was providing some shade for some people who were toiling in the field, and he got moved out of the way without his consent. Like, he just got bumped out of the way, and he's like, "Why am I getting moved?" He realized it was the wind. So he thought, well, the wind has more power than the cloud, and so I wish to be the wind. So he becomes the wind, and he creates cool breezes for those working. Every once in a while, if there's the village jerk, he'll blow them down just for fun. And he's the wind, and he realizes that wind has a lot of power until the wind reaches the edge of town where there's a large mountain, and the wind cannot move the mountain. So finally he figures it out. He's like, okay, look, the sun doesn't have the most power, the clouds don't have the most power, the wind doesn't have the most power. The mountain, the sun can't touch the mountain. The rain can't really touch the mountain. The wind can't touch the mountain. Nothing can affect the mountain. So I wish to become the mountain. Finally, he knows where the pinnacle of authority and the pinnacle of leadership and power is. He wants to be the mountain. And then he becomes the mountain. And then he feels a lowly, quote unquote, stonecutter chipping away at his feet. In my work, I used to work in finance. I worked in sales. I worked in higher education. Whenever I was an assistant manager, I always thought the manager had more power. When I was an assistant director, I always thought the director had more power. There's this myth in leadership that the person with the best title always has the most power. The funny thing is, at every level of every organization I was in, I always imagined the person at the very next level had the most power. And then I got promoted. And then I got promoted. And then I got promoted. And then I realized power isn't always about being the mountain. If you want to follow this metaphor further, power is, could I motivate a group of stonecutters to get together and do some work? So this idea from the Industrial Revolution is very hierarchical. It is very much based on management more than leadership, right? If you pick up textbooks about management and textbooks about leadership, they are having two different conversations. Oftentimes, managers are called to lead and leaders must manage, but managing is a word that's from the Industrial Revolution, which implies you are managing people and processes towards a goal, making cheeseburgers more efficiently, making cars more efficiently, whatever, right? Leading is different because it acknowledges that each person you're leading is a person with full human dignity, with lots of identities that make them them, and that to lead them effectively, you have to understand those things. When you start the journey of understanding those things, that's what we call emotional intelligence, right? So one could say that in management, emotional intelligence is important, but in leadership, emotional intelligence is built in. In other words, that's one of the things that differentiates. You see a manager who's particularly emotionally intelligent, odds are they're not just managing, they're also leading. And we can delve into that a little bit more deeply, but my book covers that to a better degree. So by the way, I want to mention this, diversity, equity, and inclusion. From time, if you've ever been in any of my live workshops or my keynotes or anything like that, you'll know that every once in a while this badge just pops up, because we have to pause and talk about this a little bit. And I just want to acknowledge that that when we were talking about the Industrial Revolution, and when I'm talking about how leadership was evolving, it was norms created by white men for other white men. Is that bad? Sometimes. Is it good? Sometimes. Is it incomplete? Pretty much all the time. And so when you think about the norms of what is professional, and I talk about this a little bit in the book when we talk about emotional management, I'll mention that aside in a minute. When we talk about what's professional, that's not a value neutral concept. That's a concept in the United States, at least, that was formed by white men for white men based on their cultural norms. And again, I'm not saying all of that is bad, but what I'm saying is it is way, way, way incomplete, and some of it is bad, and some of it might be good, but we need to reinterrogate it. We don't need to just accept it at face value. Same with the word professional, right? What does professional mean, and who established what professional means? The workforce got way more diverse when World War II happened because women entered the workforce. The GI Bill, although the GI Bill in fits and spurts allowed Black people and other people of color more access to college and more access to the world of work. Again, not across the board and not like it was intended to. It failed a lot and succeeded some, right? So it's one of those murky things where the GI Bill really helped diversify our workforce racially, but not nearly to the degree that it sort of promised, right? So anyway, that's part of this. So most of us in this call, when we think about leadership, our brains subconsciously are thinking about something called trait theory. And trait theory is an academic way of talking about the list of qualities we expect of a leader, right? I could get out a dry erase board or an Excel sheet, and I could ask everybody on this call to list what do they think leadership is? What are some key components of leadership? As a matter of fact, in the chat, tell me what you think are some key components of leadership. And so we could list those things, and we could come up with a very robust list. I would imagine things like charisma might be part of it, communication, listening effectively, empathy, timeliness, authenticity. There's a lot of things that we hope to find in leaders. But something interesting that happens is if we make a list and then we are trying to have the conversation about, well, who is a leader or isn't a leader, the question sort of becomes, okay, well, we have these 10 characteristics. What if they have 8 of the 10? Trust, compassion, stability, and hope. Oh, I love that. Thank you, Caleb. That's a great contribution. What happens if we have a list of the 10 qualities that we know leaders need to embody, and a leader embodies 8 of the 10, but not all 10? Are they a leader? What if they embody 5 of the 10? What's the cutoff point? Also, and this is something that I don't think a lot of the literature in academia talks about, but just my experience as a leadership consultant has taught me, is that there's such thing as what I call a deal breaker trait, where say your organization or you as an individual have come up with the top 10 qualities that you expect of a leader. That's great. And someone comes in, you're hiring a new director, you're hiring a new vice president, you're hiring somebody new, and they exemplify all 10 of those. And they do something that is very contrary to what you would expect of leaders. They do something, they're verbally abusive. They might be charismatic, they might be timely, they might build trust, but then to some people they're abusive, or to some people they're dishonest. And so one of the flaws with trait theory, and again, y'all, most of us think like this because most leadership books are built like this. Most leadership books are like, do these 7 things and you'll be a leader. Do these 10 things and you'll be a leader. By the way, my book is not like that. There's a part of it that's like that, but the idea that if you do these things, if you check these boxes, you have become a leader, to me is incomplete, because it's not actually examining how your mind and heart are working in the leadership space, right? And whether you are in fact growing and changing, not just exhibiting behaviors from a checklist. And so leadership trait theory has a few flaws. Number one is we don't know how many of our list you really have to have. Number two, the lists are going to vary by organizations, by industries, by sectors. And number three, what if somebody has everything on the list, but also is a jerk or also does something that's abusive or violent towards members of our community, or has violent rhetoric? And can we discount that person? In other words, are there things that I'm like, well, yeah, they're charismatic and they can reach a deadline and they can motivate people, and some of these other things we accept as leaders, but they say these racist things or these sexist things or these homophobic things or transphobic things, and in our community that's against our values. It's not on the list, but it's what I call a deal breaker trait, right? Where it's someone has done something egregious enough that even if they have the other things on paper, I don't know that I would call that person a leader, right? One little side note, this is interesting, and this is, I'm not going to get too political, although let me just make the statement that human dignity is not up for political debate. First of all, I'm just going to say that. But one of the things that's interesting is my dissertation, I studied collegiate-based leadership programs, and I've done work on collegiate leadership programs, but also in professional settings. And for college and university-based leadership programs, there was a huge bump across the nation at a particular era of our history when universities and colleges decided to start having leadership programs. I'll give you a hint. It was during a particular president's administration, and his name was Richard Nixon. I feel confident that there were administrators and faculty and other folks involved in colleges and universities sitting around tables during the Nixon administration. And as they're evaluating how effective they are as colleges and universities, I'm sure that in it, and I'm going to oversimplify this, but I'm sure they're sitting around the table going, hey, so do we have history covered? We got a history department? Great, cool. Biology, do we have a biology department? Awesome. Okay, business, great. Education, great. We've got some great departments. Is anyone teaching ethical leadership here? So yeah, during the Nixon administration and the Watergate scandal, there was a huge bump in the amount of leadership programs that colleges and universities started implementing. And the reason is because most of these colleges and universities were realized we were past the Industrial Revolution and realized that ethics was part of leadership, that being ethical was part of leadership, and that if you had all the checks on the checkbox, but then were doing something criminal or illegal or something to harm people in the community, that disqualified you, something grossly unethical, that would disqualify you, even if you had these other characteristics, right? So again, this is part of why trait theory, even though most of us in our minds, when we think about leadership, this is the thing imprinted in most of our minds. It's the subconscious idea we have of leadership. And that's okay. And we need to interrogate it. We need to pick it apart a little bit because there's more to the story. And again, if leadership is a list of qualities, and if you work for an organization that was not founded by people with lots of different identities, all with equal power around the table, then the definition of what even is leadership is going to have kind of a cultural anchor somewhere, most of the time in whiteness, most of the time driven by men, white men who are not disabled, who are overwhelmingly cisgender. Most of the time, that is who's been defining what the leadership qualities are. And so again, some organizations, there are more modern organizations that start with a much broader table at the beginning, right? And so when we talk about inclusion is not just who's at the table, but who has a voice at the table, right? And so some organizations have much more nuanced, intercultural, multicultural ideas of what leadership is, and these groups are leading us into the future, quite honestly. So this is a little timeline piece, the age of emperors and monarchs, democracies and egalitarian thought, the Industrial Revolution. Now we are emerging from the information age. So 3 questions, and I would love you to put things in the chat and tell me what you think. Well, we've talked about this a little bit. Where did authority come from? But we talked about where authority came from in the age of emperors and monarchs. But where did authority come from in the Industrial Revolution in the United States? Where does authority come from in the information age? These are more complicated questions because there are ideas that authority comes from. Like again, I worked in colleges and universities. I got some degrees. In those circles, authority comes from who can devise the best study and do a dissertation, do a research study. And so authority comes from expertise in many ways. Also in the US, we have capitalism. And in capitalistic systems, people who own companies still have authority in those companies, even if they don't have expertise, right? Some of the better leaders that I know recognize that own large businesses that don't necessarily have high degrees of emotional intelligence or don't necessarily have expertise. They are humble enough to know that they don't have the expertise, and they surround themselves with people who do have that expertise. I worked at a college that had an amazing dean of students that had no formal training or education in higher education. And me and some of the other folks on campus had that. This person was a lawyer by trade, but this person who was brilliantly humble was like, I don't know about residence life. I don't know about the career center. I don't know about campus activities. I don't know that much about how Title IX works here, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm going to surround myself with experts on these things. But this person did know the law. He was a lawyer by trade. And so the idea of where does authority come from is huge, right? Does authority come from who has sort of the expertise through study, through research, whatever? Does it come through who owns the company? Does it come from some combination of those things? By the way, I'm going to use this slideshow to talk about this slide in particular. When you think about sort of where authority comes from, again, it's connected with race and gender. It just is, right? And we have to untangle that. We need to untangle that. And again, in my book, I talk about this too. One of the challenges is that, and I'm a white guy, right? Is that sometimes when white people hear, well, your norms are bad or oppressive or whatever, sometimes my people will get defensive. Actually, pretty frequently we will get defensive, right? And so one of the ways that I present it is, hey, white men, our norms, they're not all good, all bad, or they're not all good or all bad. I'm not going to say, but they are by definition incomplete because they come from one cultural lens. They come from one kind of combination of cultural lenses. My whiteness goes with me, my manness goes with me, all those things go with me. And if I just was with other white men and we just decided what the list of leadership qualities ought to be, if we decided what gives leaders authority, if we were deciding those things in organizations that were much more diverse, then good or bad, we can talk about that in a second, but definitely incomplete, like woefully incomplete, right? And then once we realize they're incomplete, we can go back and go, okay, well, this one's bad, this one we can tweak and keep it, and this one's good, this one, even from other cultural perspectives, this one we can keep. And so the idea that it's sort of a zero-sum thing, no, but we have to be real about this. We have to be honest about this, y'all. So, so questions for discussion, right? Is there such thing as leadership or good leadership without ethics? We know there are people in history who, by the Industrial Revolution version of leadership, which is, can I motivate people towards a goal more efficiently, period, there were people motivating others to goals more efficiently that weren't good goals, that were bad goals, right? Will trait theory work in the next age? Some of the ages that I've tossed around in my brain as far as what the next age, we're leaving the information age, and I'm going to go back to this slide. I think we are currently actually in the misinformation and disinformation age, right? That the internet is mature enough that we get lots of misinformation and disinformation, and so I think really the next age is going to go one of two directions. It's either going to be called the empathy age, or, and this is one that's not up here, the discernment age. When you think about information literacy, when you read an article online, how do you know it's viable? How do you fact check your facts, right? How do you do those things? And more importantly, are you fact checking them from a particular lens that centers on human dignity, the ideas of shared governance, the ideas that hold up a society, right? Are you evaluating these things based on the impact in your city, your county, your state, your nation? Are you evaluating them that way, right? There are things in our political sphere that some parties are very, 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 very focused on that happen like 0.00017% of the time. And yet they're very focused on them for principled reasons. Voter fraud is an example of this. Very focused on it for principled reasons. And I understand the principle in the abstract. But discernment would say, well, we have data. We need to decide, is that little percentage worth our time, energy, funds, efforts, laws, etc.? Or are there other things that happen at a much more frequent rate that need time, energy, money? So this isn't a question of fact, right? There are facts that I guess voter fraud has happened, and there are facts that there are children hungry in our society. But pretending that both of those facts are equal lacks discernment, right? Discernment is what's the percentages, y'all, and what's our role here? If it's a county government, if it's a nonprofit, if it's a company that's trying to be a B corporation. If you don't know what B Corps are, it's a cool movement. You can look up B corporations. It's a really cool thing. But like, what are we orienting the knowledge towards? What are we orienting the leadership towards? Is a question. And so you've probably seen books about the 7 practices of highly effective people or things like that. Again, embodied leadership is a new term that's new in sort of Western colonized spaces, but it's the idea of a fully integrated, authentic leadership self that is ethical and that is really, really typified by emotional intelligence. In other words, to be an embodied leader, emotional intelligence is the toolbox, right? I'm going to kind of pause here. We're at the 35-minute mark, and I am going to mention my book a little bit. I've mentioned it here and there, but this is sort of one chapter of the book. Like, where did the idea of leadership come from? But next week, I'm going to discuss 5 key mindsets. So most leadership books you pick up off the shelf will say, do these 10 things and then you'll be a leader, or do these 7 things, or it's a list of behaviors, right? There's a whole psychological field called behaviorism, right? And a lot of HR departments, a lot of MBA programs, a lot of business sort of operate from this, because behavior is what we can observe, behavior is what we can modify. But there are more advanced ideas about leadership. One of my influences is Kouzes and Posner. There are others where they realize that leadership, sure, it's what you do, but it's also how you're thinking and making sense internally, how you're developing. So it's behavioral and it's developmental, right? Developmental is another field of psychology. And so developmental is, I think in a certain level of complexity during one year of my life, and then hopefully the next year, things are a little more complex. And the next year, things are a little more complex. When I was a kid, I thought there was a monster under my bed, and I was scared about having a monster under my bed. That fear was real. That fear led to behavior. By the time I was in 3rd grade, I no longer was scared that there was a monster under the bed. Something had changed. The way I made meaning got more complex. At some point, many of us crave our parents' affirmation and attention. And then oftentimes through adolescence and the teenage years, that shift from wanting parents' affirmation to wanting affirmation from a peer group, that shift happens, and that's developmental, right? By the time you're a teenager, you're probably not scared about the monster under the bed, and you probably don't care as much about your parents' approval. You've shifted it to your peer groups in a lot of cases. So developmental is kind of how you're thinking. So that's why next week and the next section of my book is 5 key mindsets. My book has 5 mindsets and then 7 skills. But picking up the book and skipping to the 7 skills part would be a waste of people's time. It would be a waste of your time. Because those skills, without adopting sort of key mindsets, aren't going to really be developmental. So the 5 key mindsets are the developmental work that I think leaders need to do first before they can do the skill building. And I hope that makes sense. And so this is me making a stand, putting my stamp on this subject that that leadership, there is a behavioral component, but that there is a mindset component that has to come first. So I want to open up the comments, the questions. If anybody has comments or questions, thoughts, or questions about my book. My book's available. I think I can post it in the chat here, at least on the LinkedIn side. I think I can post it. So it's on the LinkedIn side. And again, if you're joining me on the Google Meet, that's great. You can go over to the LinkedIn side and find this whole video later and kind of look in the chat there if you want to find the link to the book. In addition, y'all, I would encourage you, the very first link is next week's webinar. So next week, I'm going to go through the 5 key mindsets, right? So each of those 5 mindsets is critical before you build the skills. Now, a lot of us, here's the truth, here's the reality. A lot of us on this call probably already have 1, 2, 3, 4, several of the mindsets. We probably have several. A lot of us on this call probably have developed several of the 7 skills already. But there's a deep and intentional connection between the mindsets and the skills as I've laid them out. In other words, there are certain skills that if you try to build them without exploring a certain mindset, the building of it's going to be less effective than you know it can be, right? So for example, if one of the mindsets is about intercultural awareness, right? Or if one of the mindsets is about imperfection, then when you're going to build skills, really having a deep grounding in those mindsets is going to help you build those skills in a better way. And again, sometimes this is having to rebuild skills that we've already built, right? I'll tell you an example. When I was in graduate school, I'm an extrovert. I'm a naturally extroverted person. And I was in a class with an amazing professor named Bunk Span, who was a helping skills class. So he had to teach us how to listen, how to do active listening, because we were about to go and work in career centers and residence halls and fraternity and sorority offices and campus activity offices and all kinds of things in support of college students. And he, more or less threw the textbook out of the room. And we all picked this profession because we were naturally inclined to help people. We picked this profession because a lot of our friends thought we were good listeners. But he's like, yeah, you might have stumbled into being a good listener. You might have stumbled into that skill. But what if you had to do a listening boot camp where we taught you the techniques in a lab setting where you had to listen for an hour to a talking partner without talking at all? What if you had to do that to train to become a better listener? Because most of us, we build responses as we listen. So that's just one example. But that example is trying to, I'm trying to illustrate is that the connection between a mindset and a skill. That before I took that class, I was a pretty good listener. I think my friends, I think, would have called me a good listener. I was not actually that good of a listener. And so being able to go into that class to get into the mindset of what not just listening meant, but active listening, different techniques that are involved, the mindset. Then when it came to teach me to listen, then I was more well prepared. And so I hope that makes some sense on the connection between the mindsets, the 5 mindsets, and the 7 skills. So I'm going to keep the chat open for just another minute or two. But otherwise, this is the end of today's session. Please RSVP to the next week and invite some friends. I love having a good group, and it's been great for my soul to see so many of you on here today. And then also, if you're on the Google Meet, I'll send another Google Meet invite for next week. But also join us on the LinkedIn Live, because that chat is live and it's easier to kind of follow along with, and you get to see all the slides. Also, my Google Meet crowd, if you want a copy of the slides, just send me an email. Send me an email and I'll share it with you so you can see these slides kind of on your own. By the way, the last thing I'll leave you with is often the first thing I do when I do a keynote speech. And those of you who've seen my presentations know that you've seen this a lot. But in the negative space, in that little logo, the FedEx logo there, in the negative space between the E and the X, the white negative space makes an arrow. It doesn't matter if I'm giving a keynote to a room of 50 people or 300 people. Every time I show people that, 25% or more of the audience has never seen the arrow. And so I'm guessing I still see 20-ish people on LinkedIn Live, another sort of 24 over here on the Google side. I'm guessing that about 25% of you have never seen the arrow before. That's part of what I mean by a mindset, because here's the thing. When you drive home today, when you get your next FedEx package, when you see a FedEx truck, you're never going to unsee the arrow. You can't unobserve that. That's a developmental thing. You've observed it, and now you can't unobserve it. If you're blind, there's another great example of this that's not the FedEx arrow. It's called the Wilhelm scream. And if you Google the Wilhelm scream, it's a scream all of us have heard, and I'm going to guess probably 50 to 100 movies each. And so you can, even if you're not blind, you can Google this, the Wilhelm scream, W-I-L-H-E-L-M. The Wilhelm scream is something we've all heard dozens and dozens and dozens of times and may not have been aware it was there. So the mindsets are about those shifts. And then the skills are going to feel like things you might get from an MBA program, things you might get from HR training, that kind of thing. And so again, but once you've done that work on the mindset part, the growing, you've tilled the soil richly and prepared the soil richly through the mindset process. And the plants, when it comes time to actually grow plants and harvest plants, it's going to go so much better because the soil is so much richer. Anyway, again, thank you all for joining. Be sure to RSVP to next week's session. If you don't have a copy of my book yet, get a copy of my book. It's on sale through my website. The link is right over here on the LinkedIn Live. But again, thank you for spending part of your Friday with me on your leadership journey. And I hope to engage with you again next week. Take care.